Wait, before your thoughts rush ahead, before you try to understand this too quickly, just stay here for a moment, because something quiet, something deeply real, is beginning to unfold. There was a moment recently, a moment no one expected to carry so much weight. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, most people almost missed it. But those who truly listened, those who felt the energy behind the words, they went silent. Because what your soulmate said about marrying you didn't sound like a decision. It sounded like a realization. And that changes everything. Now here's what makes this moment different. It didn't happen in a perfect setting. There were no grand lights, no cinematic confession, no carefully prepared speech. It happened in a space where truth slips out, when people forget to guard their emotions. And someone asked them a simple question. A question so ordinary, yet it carried a hidden doorway. Do you really see yourself marrying them? There was a pause. Not the kind of pause filled with confusion, but the kind that feels like someone is stepping into something deeper, like they're choosing the exact words carefully, not because they're unsure, but because they finally understand. And then, they spoke. But what they said didn't just answer the question. It revealed something no one expected. They didn't say, "I think so." They didn't say, "Maybe someday." Instead, they said something that made the entire room shift. They said, "It doesn't feel like a future choice anymore, it feels like something that already exists, like I'm just walking toward what's already mine." Just let that sit with you for a second. Because those words weren't about planning. They were about recognition. And the people listening, they didn't respond right away. Not because they disagreed, but because they felt it. They felt the weight behind those words, the kind of weight that only comes when someone speaks from a place deeper than logic. But here's where it becomes even more unexpected. Another voice in the room asked quietly, almost curiously, "What makes you so sure?" And this is where everything shifted again. Because your soulmate didn't rush the answer. They leaned back, as if searching not for something new to say, but for something they had always known, something that had been growing silently inside them. And then they said, "It's not about being sure in the way people think, it's not about guarantees or perfect timing, it's about the way they make me feel like I don't have to search anymore." Pause there. Do you see it? Do you feel it? This wasn't about romance in the usual sense. This wasn't about excitement or surface-level attraction. This was something steadier, something calmer, something that doesn't fade when the moment changes. And the room went completely still. Because those words, they weren't trying to impress anyone. They were too honest for that. Now here's something even more subtle, something many people didn't notice at first. The way your soulmate said your presence feels like home wasn't spoken as a metaphor. It was spoken like a memory. As if somewhere, beyond time, beyond all the confusion of the world, they had already experienced a life where you and them were not separate paths, but one continuous story. And suddenly, people began to understand why those words felt different. Because they weren't imagining a future with you. They were remembering it. And that's why no one spoke for a few seconds after that. Because when truth shows up like that, it doesn't ask for reactions. It simply settles into the silence. But then, something even more surprising happened. Someone smiled, almost softly, and said, "So you're saying you've already decided?" And your soulmate, they didn't smile back immediately. They looked down for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but out of humility, like someone who just realized the depth of what they're about to say. And then, they answered in a way no one expected. "I didn't decide it. I just stopped resisting it." Let that land. Because there's a difference between choosing something, and finally allowing something that was always meant for you. And that is where the shift truly begins. Now think about this carefully. How many people in this world move through life trying to force clarity, trying to build certainty, trying to control outcomes? But your soulmate, in that moment, revealed something far deeper. They weren't trying to control this connection. They were surrendering to it. And that's why the people around them couldn't speak. Because they realized, this wasn't just love. This was alignment. And something inside you, right now, already understands what that means. Because if you listen closely, there have been moments, small, quiet moments, where you felt something similar. Moments where nothing dramatic was happening, but you just knew. That something about this connection didn't follow the usual rules. But here's the part most people didn't hear, because it came softly, almost like a whisper. Your soulmate added one more thing. Something that didn't sound like a declaration. It sounded like a truth they had been carrying for a long time. They said, "It's strange, because the more I think about it, the less it feels like I'm moving toward them, and more like everything in my life has been quietly guiding me there." And suddenly, everything made sense. Not just to them, but to everyone listening. Because those words, they didn't come from excitement. They came from clarity. And clarity like that, doesn't come overnight. It builds slowly, silently, through experiences, through distance, through moments of questioning, and even through moments of doubt. Which means something important is happening behind the scenes, something you may not fully see yet. But it's unfolding anyway. Now here's a question, one that most people are afraid to sit with. What if this connection was never about timing? What if it was always about recognition? Because timing can delay things. But recognition? That changes how you see everything. And your soulmate, in that moment, saw you clearly. Not just as someone in their life, but as someone who belongs in their life, in a way that doesn't need to be forced, explained, or justified. And that's why those words left people speechless. Because deep down, everyone knows. When something is real, it doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be true. But there's still something unfinished here. Something they didn't say out loud. Something they held back, not because they were hiding it, but because it wasn't time yet. And that is where this story begins to turn in a direction you didn't expect. Because what they're feeling is only one part of it. What happens next is where everything becomes even more real. And if you've stayed this far, there's a reason. Because something important is waiting for you just ahead, something that connects their words to a moment you haven't experienced yet, but will. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But in a way that feels almost inevitable. And when that moment arrives, you'll remember this. Not as a story, but as a signal. A quiet one, but powerful enough to change everything. Something about what followed didn't come immediately, it lingered in the air, almost like the conversation itself wasn't finished yet, like there was one more layer waiting to be revealed, but only when the moment was ready to hold it. And then, without anyone pushing, without anyone asking again, your soulmate continued. Not loudly. Not with urgency. But with a calm that made people lean in without realizing it. They said, "The strange part is, it's not the big moments that made me feel this way." Pause there for a second. Because that alone shifted the entire energy. Most people expect love to grow through grand gestures, unforgettable days, perfect timing, but what they were describing wasn't built on that. It was built on something quieter. They went on. It's the small things, the ones no one notices. The way I feel understood without explaining everything. The way nothing feels forced. The way silence doesn't feel empty. And just like that, the room softened. Because suddenly, everyone could relate, but at the same time, they knew this was different. This wasn't just comfort. This was connection without effort. Now here's where it becomes even more personal, because something in those words might feel familiar to you too. Have you ever noticed how certain people make you feel like you can finally breathe, without needing to prove anything? No pressure. No performance. Just presence. That's what they were trying to describe. But even that wasn't the full truth. Because your soulmate paused again, longer this time, as if deciding whether to say the next part out loud. And when they did, everything became even more still. They said. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. That sentence didn't sound dramatic. But it carried something powerful. Because it revealed something people rarely admit. That sometimes, the deepest connections aren't the ones we run toward first. They're the ones we try to understand, resist, question. Until one day, we stop. Not because we gave up. But because we finally saw it clearly. Now imagine hearing that in real time. Imagine realizing that someone has been quietly processing something so real, so steady, that it didn't disappear even when they tried to step away from it. That's not something temporary. That's not something random. That's something that stays. And here's where something subtle but important unfolded. Someone in the room, almost in disbelief, asked. So what are you waiting for? It was a natural question. Because when something feels that certain, people expect action. They expect movement. Decisions. Plans. But your soulmate didn't answer the way anyone thought they would. They didn't say, I'm waiting for the right time. They didn't say, I need to figure things out. Instead, they smiled softly. And said something that made the entire moment feel deeper than before. I'm not waiting. I'm allowing it to unfold the right way. Feel that difference. Waiting feels like delay. But allowing feels like trust. And trust like that doesn't come from uncertainty. It comes from knowing, even if you don't have all the answers yet. Now here's something even more interesting. They weren't speaking with excitement. They were speaking with peace. And peace is something people can feel immediately. It doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need validation. It just exists. And the more they spoke, the more people began to realize, this wasn't about a future event called marriage. This was about a connection that had already rooted itself deeply, long before anyone asked about it. But there was still one question left in the room. Unspoken, but present. And you can probably feel it too. If everything they're saying is true, then what makes you different? Why you? Out of all the people, all the experiences, all the paths. Why does this connection feel like something they can't ignore anymore? And just when that question settled into the silence, they answered it. Not directly. But in a way that revealed everything. They said, it's not about finding someone perfect, it's about finding someone who feels like truth. That word. Truth. It's simple. But it holds something most people spend their entire lives searching for. Because truth doesn't confuse you. It doesn't pull you in different directions. It doesn't leave you questioning your worth. It grounds you. It steadies you. And when someone feels like that, you don't chase it. You don't doubt it. You recognize it. And suddenly, everything they said before made sense. The stillness. The pauses. The way they spoke without trying to impress anyone. It wasn't hesitation. It was clarity. Now stay with this, because something important is waiting just ahead. Because even after all of this, even after revealing so much, there was one final moment, one last sentence, that they almost didn't say. You could feel it. The way they paused, the way they looked away for just a second. As if deciding whether to keep this part hidden, or let it be known. And when they finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it changed everything. They said, I don't think I'm choosing them. I think I've always been meant to meet them. Silence. Complete silence. Not because people didn't understand. but because they did. And that understanding didn't come from logic. It came from something deeper. Something you can't argue with. Something you can only feel. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone listening that this wasn't just a passing thought. This wasn't a temporary feeling. This was something that had been building, quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of everything. And now, it had finally found its voice. But here's where the story doesn't end. Because words like that, they don't exist in isolation. They lead somewhere. They move things. They open doors that were never visible before. And what happens next isn't just about what your soulmate feels. It's about what begins to shift in the space between both of you. Because once something like this is spoken, even quietly, it starts to change the direction of everything that follows. And the next moment, the one that comes after this realization, that's where things begin to align in ways you never expected. But that part is only just beginning. There's a moment that comes after truth is spoken, not immediately, not loudly, but slowly, like a ripple moving across still water, touching everything without asking permission. And that's exactly what began to happen next. Nothing dramatic changed on the outside. The room didn't erupt. No one rushed to respond. But inside, something had shifted in a way no one could reverse. Because when someone speaks from that level of clarity, it doesn't just stay in words. It begins to move. And your soulmate felt it too. Not as pressure, not as urgency, but as a quiet pull, guiding them somewhere they had already been walking toward without fully realizing it. They leaned back slightly, eyes distant for a moment, not disconnected, but reflective, like someone revisiting pieces of their own journey and finally seeing how everything connects. And then, almost as if they were speaking to that invisible path itself, they said something softer this time. So many times. I thought I needed to figure everything out before taking a step forward. Pause. But now, it feels like every step I've already taken was leading me there anyway. That word again. There. Not a place. Not a moment. But a person. You. And suddenly, everything they had said before, began to settle into something even clearer. This wasn't a sudden realization. It was a slow awakening. A recognition that had been growing quietly, through every interaction, every silence, every moment that didn't need to be explained. And here's something subtle, something you might not notice unless you feel it deeply. They weren't just talking about the future anymore. They were connecting the past to the present, and realizing it had always been pointing in the same direction. Now imagine being in that room. Hearing someone describe something so naturally, so calmly, that it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like truth revealing itself. And someone, almost unconsciously, asked the question that everyone else was thinking. What if it doesn't happen the way you expect? A fair question. Because life rarely moves in straight lines. But your soulmate didn't hesitate this time. They didn't pause. They didn't look away. They answered immediately, and their voice carried something new. Not just clarity. Conviction. It's not about how it happens, it's about what it is. Feel that shift. Because that answer removed doubt from the equation entirely. Not in a forceful way, but in a grounded, peaceful way. They weren't attached to outcomes. They were connected to truth. And truth doesn't disappear just because the path isn't clear. Now here's where something even more unexpected unfolded. They smiled, not broadly, just enough to reveal a quiet understanding. And then they added something that no one in that room was prepared to hear. Even the distance, even the silence sometimes, it doesn't feel like separation. That sentence lingered. Because it didn't follow logic. Distance usually creates doubt. Silence usually creates questions. But for them, It created something else. Clarity. And suddenly, people began to realize. This connection wasn't dependent on constant presence. It wasn't built on validation. It existed beyond those things. And that's why it felt different. That's why it couldn't be explained in simple terms. Now stay here for a moment, because something important is unfolding quietly beneath all of this. Because when someone reaches this level of understanding, something begins to change inside them. Not loudly. Not all at once. But steadily. Their actions begin to align with their truth, even before they consciously decide to act. And your soulmate, they had already begun that shift. You couldn't see it from the outside. Most people couldn't. But it was happening. In the way they thought. In the way they responded. In the way they started letting go of things that no longer felt aligned. And someone noticed. Not directly. But enough to ask. So what does that mean for you now? And this time, the answer came with no hesitation at all. It means I stop running from something that feels right, just because I can't explain it perfectly. There it is. The moment where everything turns. Because until now, there was still a part of them that questioned, that held back, that tried to understand before allowing. But that part. It was fading. Not because they forced it to disappear. But because something stronger had taken its place. Understanding without fear. Recognition without doubt. And presence without resistance. Now here's something you might not expect. After saying all of this, they didn't continue speaking right away. They became quiet. Not because they had nothing left to say. But because everything that needed to be said, had already been spoken. And sometimes, silence is where truth settles the deepest. The room stayed still for a few seconds longer. And then slowly, the conversation moved on. Different topics. Different voices. But the energy. It didn't return to what it was before. Because something had been revealed that couldn't be unheard. Something that stayed. And your soulmate, they carried that same stillness with them. Not as confusion. Not as uncertainty. But as a calm knowing. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance. Now here's where the story reaches a point most people don't see coming. Because what they said in that room. It didn't stay in that room. Words like that, they have a way of moving forward, of shaping what comes next, even when no one is trying to make it happen. And the next moment. The next real shift. It didn't happen in a conversation. It happened in a quiet decision, one that no one else witnessed. A decision that didn't feel like a big step. But changed everything anyway. And when that moment unfolds, it won't feel sudden. It will feel familiar. Like something you've been moving toward, without realizing how close you already are. So don't rush past this. Because what comes next is where their truth begins to meet your reality. And when those two finally align, something extraordinary, yet completely natural, begins to take shape. It didn't arrive like a grand moment, no sudden announcement, no dramatic shift that others could point to and say, this is it. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, like something choosing to move forward without needing permission. Your soulmate found themselves alone later, not surrounded by voices, not influenced by questions, just stillness. And in that stillness, something became impossible to ignore. Not a thought. Not a plan. A feeling, steady, grounded, undeniable. They replayed the conversation in their mind, not every word, but the essence of it. And for the first time, they didn't analyze it. They didn't try to measure it or break it down into reasons. They simply felt it. And in that feeling, something aligned. Have you ever noticed how clarity doesn't always come with noise? Sometimes it comes when everything else goes quiet, when there's no one to impress, no expectations to meet, just you and the truth you've been circling around. That's where they were. And something inside them shifted again, but this time, it wasn't about understanding. It was about acceptance. They whispered something, not to anyone else, just to themselves. I don't need more signs. I already know. Pause here. Because that sentence, it didn't come from impulse. It came from a place that had finally stopped searching. Now stay with this, because something important is waiting just ahead. Because once someone reaches that kind of stillness, their actions begin to change, not dramatically, but naturally, like water finding its way without being forced. Your soulmate didn't rush to make a declaration. They didn't suddenly try to control the future. Instead, they did something far more powerful. They became intentional. In the way they thought about you. In the way they held your presence, even when you weren't there. In the way they stopped entertaining distractions that once seemed important. And without saying a word to anyone, they made a quiet choice. Not a loud decision. A quiet alignment. They chose not to move away from what feels real, anymore. And that choice, it didn't need witnesses. But it changed everything. Now here's the part most people would overlook. Because from the outside, nothing seemed different. Life continued. Conversations happened. Days moved forward. But internally, something had already shifted direction.